Thank you so much for having me. We need to start serving tea in all of my lectures. So before I begin, I would absolutely love to thank both the Human Rights Council and the Concord Free Public Library for having me here today. It's kind of an honor to finally work the big room here, the main stage, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. The story is well known. In July of 1846, while walking into Concord from his Walden Pond house to have a shoe repaired, Henry Thoreau was stopped by Constable Sam Staples and asked to pay his poll tax for the year. When Thoreau refused, as a protest against the Mexican War and the issue of slavery, Staples arrested the 29-year-old and put him in the Concord jail for, as Thoreau later wrote, a novel and interesting night. It would have surprised nobody in Concord that Thoreau had taken an anti-slavery stance. He did, after all, come from an abolitionist family. Since his mother and sisters were quite vocal in their support of William Lloyd Garrison, it was only natural that Henry would also believe in the motto, "No union with slaveholders," and that meant no voting and no paying of taxes. Thoreau would spend one night in the Concord jail. He would be released the next morning because the tax was paid, not by him, but by somebody else, probably his Aunt Maria Thoreau. He then returned to his home at the pond and went on a huckleberry picking expedition with some friends, quote, on one of our highest hills and where the state was nowhere to be seen. There is a story that claims that Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Thoreau while he was in the jail. You probably all know the story. Emerson arrives and says, "Henry, why are you in jail?" And Thoreau replies, "Waldo, why are you not in jail?" It's a great story, but it never happened. In fact, Emerson knew nothing of Thoreau's arrest until the next day, after Thoreau had been released. And Emerson heard it not from Thoreau, but from Bronson Alcott. For his part, Emerson would write in his journal that Thoreau's actions were, quote, mean and skulking and in bad taste. But after discussing the matter personally with Thoreau, Emerson had to admit that his friend's stance was stronger than most abolitionists. The abolitionists denounce the war and give much time to it, but they pay the tax, he said in his journal. Because of this experience, Thoreau went on to write an essay that has become one of the most influential political works in American literature, the essay we now know as Civil Disobedience. It went through several incarnations before it was first published in 1849. Although his incarceration occurred while he was living at Walden, the lecture about his jailing was not started by Thoreau until after he left the pond in 1847. So naturally, friends and fellow townspeople had been curious about the night in jail and the reasons why he was arrested in the first place. Once Thoreau had moved out of his Walden Pond house and into the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson in October of 1847, he began working on the lecture about his jailing and the reasons behind his action. On January 26, 1848, H.D. Thoreau of Concord spoke at the Concord Lyceum on, quote, the relation of the individual to the state. We don't know how the people of Concord reacted to the lecture, and the only review we have is from Bronson Alcott. In his journal, he wrote that Thoreau's lecture was, quote, an admirable statement, and that, quote, an attentive audience heard Thoreau's pertinent, well-considered, and reasoned statement. Alcott's enjoyment of the lecture is no surprise. He himself had been arrested in 1843 for non-payment of taxes while he was protesting slavery. And this action no doubt influenced Thoreau to do the same thing 3 years later. On February 16, 1848, Thoreau again spoke on his jailing before the Concord Lyceum. This time he called it the rights and duties of the individual in relation to the state. This was not simply a repeat of the lecture that he'd given 3 weeks earlier. Instead, it was probably an expanded and revised version of the earlier piece. Alcott was again in the audience at this second lecture, and Thoreau later reported in a letter to Emerson, who was in England at the time, that Alcott was satisfied over the lecture. The following year, in the spring of 1849, Thoreau was contacted by Elizabeth Peabody and asked if he would submit his lecture for publication in her new periodical, Aesthetic Papers. Thoreau reluctantly agreed. He was working on his first book at the time. But the essay saw print for the first time in May 1849 under the new title, Resistance to Civil Government. The essay, much like the magazine itself, was barely noticed by anybody, except a few of Thoreau's friends. Now, one reviewer did say that Thoreau was crazy, and the other said that if he didn't like America, he should move to France. As it turned out, this premier issue was the only issue of Aesthetic Papers, and Resistance to Civil Government died a quick literary death and remained obscure in Thoreau's lifetime. There were also a couple of essays. There's one by Ralph Waldo Emerson and a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So why this magazine bombed? Now, Thoreau, of course, was not the only one in Concord in his anti-slavery stance. But before we begin that, there's a difference in 1846 between being anti-slavery and abolitionist. Every right-thinking person, we would hope, is anti-slavery. Makes sense. But if you're going to be an abolitionist, then you're becoming an activist. Abolitionists were the ones that were boycotting Southern products. They were the ones that were writing petitions to Congress. They were the ones holding bazaars and fairs to raise money for anti-slavery causes. So while most people, hopefully in Concord, were anti-slavery, not everybody in town was necessarily an abolitionist. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson himself didn't really want to speak out on public issues like slavery. He said that public issues are odious and hurtful, and it seems like meddling or leaving your work. And then I see what havoc it makes with any good mind. And he called abolition a dissipated philanthropy. That'll change. After the abolitionist Grimke sisters lectured in town in the autumn of 1837, the Female Anti-Slavery Society was established in Concord at the home of Mrs. Samuel Barrett. Mary Brooks became a key member of the society, and the membership included her, Mrs. Ann Bigelow, Cynthia Dunbar Thoreau, and her daughters Helen and Sophia, Mrs. Minot Pratt, Mrs. Lydian Emerson and her daughter Ellen, Mrs. Lucy Brown, and Mrs. Abigail Alcott. So there's some pretty heavy hitters there. Also among the founders of the society was Susan Garrison. Her membership is notable because she was the lone woman of color listed in the Female Anti-Slavery Society records. Here are the Mrs. Thoreaus, Sophia and Helen. To the left is Mary Merrick Brooks, to the right is Ann Bigelow, two of the most important women in the Anti-Slavery Society. Over the next 2.5 decades, the Female Anti-Slavery Society would be front and center in the fight against slavery, and it became one of the best-known societies in the country. But while these women were involved in the anti-slavery battle, as I said earlier, Concord itself was not necessarily considered an abolitionist town. In fact, anti-slavery lectures at the Concord Lyceum were frowned upon. And throughout the 1830s and 40s, abolitionism was very much on the fringe of polite society. Out of a population of 2,000 people, perhaps only several dozen Concordians would have considered themselves abolitionists. But that was starting to change with the Grimkes coming to town. The Concord Yeoman Gazette said that their lectures in town, quote, awakened an increased interest in this solemn and important subject among our citizens. So Concord was starting to rouse itself from its anti-slavery stupor. Now, this people not really wanting to be involved in abolition changed in 1850 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Writing petitions to raise awareness and holding bazaars to raise money for abolition now took a back seat to something more drastic, the Underground Railroad. The new fugitive slave law now demanded that all U.S. citizens return alleged runaways to their masters or face fines or imprisonment. Any person aiding or abetting a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was subject to 6 months imprisonment and $1,000 fine. Furthermore, officers who captured a fugitive slave were entitled to a bonus or promotion for their work. Judges who decided in favor of the slaveholders reclaiming the property got a bigger bonus if they decided in favor of the masters. So a federal judge, if you decided in favor of the masters, you got $10. If you judge in favor of the runaway, you got $5. Because of the new law, cities like Boston began to utilize vigilance committees in an avenue of resistance against the slave catchers. These vigilance committees were a sign of militant abolitionism and led to fugitives being rescued. Armed patrols in the streets kept an eye out for slave catchers, and the harassment of federal marshals who came to Boston was a daily occurrence. Suddenly it seemed that people who had little or no opinion about slavery were now protesting not only the fugitive slave law, but slavery in general. As one wealthy Bostonian later remembered, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned conservatives and woke up the next day stark mad abolitionists." Meanwhile, in Concord, a town filled with famous personalities and radical reformers, the news of the fugitive slave law was met with anger and dismay. It seems that almost everyone, from the famous to the not so famous, had something to say about it. Ralph Waldo Emerson had done a complete turn on his attitude about speaking out. And he said in his journal, "This filthy act was made in the 19th century by people who could read and write. I will not obey it, by God." But the diehard abolitionist in the Emerson house was not Waldo, but his wife, Lydia Jackson Emerson. In fact, Waldo's transition to speaking out on slavery was in no small part due to her radicalism. She was the woman who decorated her front gate in black crepe on the 4th of July instead of red, white, and blue, as a sign of mourning for the slave. And she had a huge influence on the sage of Concord, speaking out on slavery. As for the fugitive slave law, Lydian called it, and this sounds very much like recent events, "our national shame in standing on the neck of the enslaved black man." That's Ellen Emerson next to her. The Emersons were not the only one in Concord who were fired up over the new law. While anti-slavery sentiment had not been popular even a few years before, the climate had now changed in Concord. Bronson Alcott, himself a lifelong abolitionist, journalized in 1850, "Even Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison are now listened to with some respect, and their doctrines and measures find favor from a very excellent body amongst us." Now, to the Alcott family, the fugitive slave law was a moot point. They'd been involved in the Underground Railroad for several years. The home on Lexington Road that they called the Hillside sheltered one, possibly two runaway slaves in the winter of 1847. Bronson Alcott would write of one of the fugitives, "His stay with us has given an image and a name to the dire entity of slavery, and was an impressive lesson to my children, bringing before them the wrongs of the black man and his tales of woe." His wife Abba was equally dedicated to the cause, and she would write about their guest saying, "We have had an interesting fugitive here for 2 weeks, right from Maryland. He was anxious to get to Canada, and we have forwarded him the best way we could. His sufferings have been great." Activity on the Underground Railroad in Concord ramped up after the passage of the fugitive slave law. Besides the Hillside, we know of at least 6 other homes in Concord, it was probably more, that harbored fugitive slaves. Some of the people involved in this highly illegal activity were Abel Haywood Wheeler, Henry Thoreau, Edmund Hosmer, Mary Merritt Brooks, Mary Rice, William Whiting, and Anne Bigelow. In an 1892 interview with Edward Emerson, Mrs. Bigelow said that Concord became more active in the Underground Railroad after 1850. And much like the bigger towns and cities, Concord had its own vigilance committee to shepherd fugitives safely through the town. Some of the places we know, of course, is the hillside right there, now the wayside. A few years ago, it became a dedicated marker showing that the wayside was part of the Underground Railroad. The Thoreau House on Main Street, we know that runaway slaves were hidden there. And then there's the Bigelow House. Where's Rosa? That's her house. The most famous fugitive slave to come through Concord was Shadrach Minkins. Minkins was the first fugitive to be captured in Boston after the passage of the new law. Many fugitives considered Boston a safe haven since it was the hotbed of anti-slavery sentiment. William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips and Lewis Hayden all called Boston home, and it was a relatively safe place for runaway slaves, at least until 1850. Minkins had escaped slavery in Virginia in early 1850 and was living in Boston as a free man and working at a coffee house on Beacon Hill. But in February 1851, he was seized by federal marshals under the auspices of the new fugitive slave law. Brought before a judge for an initial hearing, hundreds of people, both black and white, gathered outside the Boston courthouse to protest his arrest. Several dozen men, mostly black men, including Lewis Hayden, rushed into the courthouse and bodily dragged him outside and onto the streets, where they disappeared with him through the crowd into Boston's West End. The judges and the marshals had no idea what hit him. The next morning, in the pre-dawn hours of February 16, 1851, Minkins found himself in the company of Lewis Hayden in Concord at the home of Anne and Francis Bigelow on Sudbury Street. As Minkins rested, plans were made for Mr. Bigelow to take the fugitive to Leominster. From there, he would be taken through Vermont to the American-Canadian border, where he would cross over to Quebec and freedom. But while Minkins' rescue was successful for the Boston-Concord abolitionists, there were failures. Another fugitive, Thomas Sims, was captured in Boston and returned to his owner in Georgia, and in 1854, Anthony Burns would be returned to Virginia. Minkins, of course, was by no means the only fugitive to come through Concord, and one has to wonder exactly how many runaways were helped by the Concord Vigilance Committee. The exact number, of course, will never be known, but Anne Bigelow later remembered that after 1850, quote, nearly every week some fugitive would be forwarded with the utmost secrecy to Concord to be harbored overnight. An estimated 300 fugitives arrived in Boston in the 1850s. And one wonders how many of them actually came through Concord. The Thoreau family had long been involved in the anti-slavery movement, and they were followers of William Lloyd Garrison. They believed in no union with slaveholders, and they wanted nothing to do with the union so long as it continued to support slavery. As Henry Thoreau would write in 1849, I cannot consider it my government when it is the slave's government as well. The Thoreau family supported another tenet of Garrisonianism, disunion. Throughout the 1840s, Cynthia and her daughters were involved with signing petitions and asking for the North to secede from the slaveholding South. It seems that Henry Thoreau was a regular participant in the Underground Railroad. Again, Anne Bigelow would remember that Thoreau, quote, more than any other man, helped nurse wounded or hurt runaways. He would also purchase railway tickets for them and occasionally escort them to a train station to make sure that they were safely shepherded north. With the start of the Civil War in 1861, Concord, like every other city and town in the North, sent off men to put down the rebellion of southern states. At first, the war was not being fought to end slavery, but to save the Union. But abolitionists in Concord and elsewhere knew that the day would come when Lincoln would need to free the South's 4 million enslaved people. 450 men would join the Union Army from Concord. 49 of them would make the ultimate sacrifice and would be killed in battle, or die from wounds and disease. Here's our marker on the Civil War monument, our brand new marker on the Civil War monument. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. After the Civil War, Concord citizens, primarily women, would continue to fight for civil rights, but this time the fight was for women. The women in Concord were among those who fought for the right to vote, and the suffragists in Concord began organizing and went from the parlor and lecture hall to the town square and city streets. A couple of really great late 19th century signs about women's rights. A woman's sphere is wherever she makes good. And then Lucy Stone's vision of women's suffrage. Social reformer, suffragist, and author Harriet Robinson worked as a mill girl for the Tremont Corporation at Lowell, Massachusetts, starting when she was 10 years old. Harriet and the other women were paid $2 a week, and in October of 1836, the mills cut the wages of the workers. The women gathered after work and organized together to protest this pay cut. And their protest against wage cuts was the first protest for such a thing in United States history. When Hanson was 11 years old, when the strike began, she jumped into the demonstration and joined her older co-workers in demanding better treatment. She later claimed that she led a room full of workers out of the mill and would write, "I marched out and was followed by the others. As I look back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I shall ever be again until my own beloved state gives to its women citizens the right of suffrage." They were successful in their protest, and they had their wages reinstated to what it was before. In 1848, Harriet married Concord-born journalist William Stevens Robinson, a Concordian who was also a classmate of Henry Thoreau. And she shared with her husband a principled commitment to the abolition of slavery. They were all over Middlesex County. They lived in Lowell, they lived in Boston, but from 1854 to 57, they lived here in Concord and rented the Thoreau's Texas house on Belknap Street from the Thoreau family. Harriet thought that the Thoreau family was, quote, eccentric, and she thought that Henry Thoreau was, quote, shiftless, but she called Ralph Waldo Emerson divine. And at the time, there was a popular conception that Thoreau and Emerson looked like each other, and she said that she didn't think so because next to Emerson, who is a god, Thoreau doesn't really match up. Harriet joined the Concord Women's Anti-Slavery Society, and she described in an 1877 memoir of her husband, a women's anti-slavery society has been formed in Concord at the home of Mrs. Samuel Barrett. It had 70 members at first, but when William Lloyd Garrison attacked the church, calling it a bulwark of slavery, the society was divided, and a new organization was formed of radical abolitionists who sympathized with Mr. Garrison, regardless of church and state. And she talks about its membership. She talks about the subscription festivals that they would have and the anti-slavery fairs. And some of the people she mentions were Mrs. Nathan Brooks, Mrs. John Thoreau, Mrs. Bigelow, Mrs. Samuel Barrett, Mrs. Timothy Prescott, Mrs. Minot Pratt, Mrs. Emerson, Mrs. Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, Mrs. Lucy Brown, Mrs. Alcott, Mary Rice, Miss Sophia Thoreau, Ann Whiting, Ellen Emerson, all the people that we know of. After the Civil War, Harriet became a leading suffragist. She testified before Congress on the subject of women's suffrage, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded today, by the way, in 1869, she formed the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, and she worked closely with with a lot of the leading suffragists of the time. When the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association was created in May of 1881 at the Tremont Temple in Boston, she was the opening speaker, and it was her resolution, quote, "Whereas we believe that it is not safe to trust the great question of women's political rights solely to the legislature or to the voters of the state, therefore resolved that it is the duty of the women of Massachusetts to organize an active work to secure a 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution." As a girl, she started writing poems for the Lowell Offering, which were the mill girls were creating at the time, their local newspaper. And then in later years, she wrote Massachusetts in the Woman's Suffrage Movement in 1881, and she wrote her memoirs called Loom and Spindle in 1898, and both she and her husband are buried over in Sleepy Hollow. You better know who that is. In 1879, Massachusetts passed a law granting women the right to vote in town election on issues involving children and education. The importance of this new opportunity for women was realized by Louisa Alcott, and she immediately got to work trying to encourage the women of Concord to register and vote in the next town election. She organized reading groups on the importance of voting, and she passed petitions around town encouraging women to register. But Louisa quickly became frustrated by the resistance that she encountered. Many of the women of Concord were not in the least bit interested in voting. The women complained that they were just too busy running their households to bother, or that their husbands would take care of the voting for them. Louisa wrote about her frustration with the women in her journal, quote, "Trying to stir up the women about suffrage. They are so timid and slow. Drove about and drummed up women to my suffrage meeting. So hard to move women out of the old ruts." To help motivate them, she said she gave them a good scolding and offered to drive the timid sheep to the fatal spot where they seemed to expect some awful doom. The negativity did not stop Louisa from registering. In fact, she proudly declared in her journal that she was the first woman in Concord to register in her name as a voter. On March 29, 1880, Louisa, along with 19 other women, including her sister Anna, attended the Concord town meeting to officially cast their ballot for school board. When the big day arrived, she wrote that the woman, quote, "were all in good spirits and not in the least daunted by the awful deed about to be done." After 2 hours of town meeting, the election of the school committee came up for the vote. Louisa's father, Bronson Alcott, nobly suggested that the women should vote first. It was such an auspicious occasion, and the motion was carried. The women stood up and walked to the front of the hall to cast their ballots, and the local newspaper reported on the historic moment, quote, "Many a feminine heart palpitated with excitement in preparation for the trying ordeal of passing in front of nearly 200 great horned men and boys to deposit their maiden vote." Not surprisingly, Louisa was the first person in line. Anna voted next. After it was done, Louisa reported that all was well. Quote, "No bolt fell on our audacious heads. No earthquake shook the town. But a pleasing surprise created a general outbreak of laughter and applause throughout the Concord town hall." Then came a surprise after the women all sat down. Judge Hoare announced, "The polls are closed." The men were not allowed to vote. The men, noted Louisa, were very perturbed, but the deed was done, and she concluded that the women had done a fine job, saying, "We elected a good school committee." But the battle for suffrage in Concord was not necessarily won. In another town election the following year, Louisa encountered still more resistance from the women of Concord, saying, "Saw my townswomen about voting, hard work to stir them up. Cake and servants are more interesting." Her town, she feared, was, quote, degenerating into a museum of revolutionary relics. And Concordians seem to be more content with the reflected glory of dead forefathers and imported geniuses. This is George Frisbee Hoare, a member of Concord's prominent and influential royal family. He studied at a boarding school run by Samuel and Sarah Bradford Ripley in Waltham, Massachusetts, those people from the old manse. He graduated from Harvard College in 1846 and earned his law degree at Harvard Law in 1849. He was admitted to the bar and settled in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he practiced law. Initially, he was a member of the Free Soil Party, but he joined the Republican Party shortly after its founding in 1854. Hoare was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1852, to the Massachusetts Senate in 1857. He represented Massachusetts as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1869 to 1877, and then he served 5 terms as a United States Senator until his death in 1904. As a representative and senator, he was a radical Republican and a longtime champion for the abolition of slavery. He also campaigned for the rights of African Americans and Native Americans, which included the reusing of tribal lands for individual settlement of Native Americans. His shining moment took place in 1882 when he was the only United States senator to vote against the Chinese Exclusion Act. He called it nothing less than the legalization of racial discrimination. He also argued in the Senate in favor of women's suffrage as early as 1886. He was one of only 7 senators to vote against the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which abolished women's suffrage in Utah after it had been a territorial right since 1870. The Congress taking away human rights. So where does Concord stand today in terms of human rights? There are signs, well, not these signs. These signs are now gone. These were removed recently because they were considered, firstly, historically inaccurate, and secondly, rather racist. And I have to say, I supported this. I spent my whole life as a historian trying to get the facts right. These do not get the facts right. And removing signs like this is not erasing history. This is correcting history. But there are signs all over Concord still about Concord doing the right thing when it comes to human rights. George Washington Dugan, our only black citizen who died in the Civil War, he is now on the Civil War Monument. He was in the 54th Mass. Took a long time, but he's up there now. There are signs all around town that we're doing the right thing. The one thing that I'm happy about this is that 5 years ago, maybe several years ago, barely anybody knew who Ellen Garrison was. Now the whole town knows who Ellen Garrison was. She's taken her place with all of these other folks we've been talking about. There are signs all around town that Concord is still doing the right thing. There are signs and flags all around town that Concord is doing the right thing for marginalized people. There are signs all around town. This is the relatively new trail at Walden Pond, made more accessible for people with handicaps to get down to the pond and see where Henry's house was. We see these people every Friday around town, marching for peace. So what is Concord doing today? Throughout history, Americans have always been in fear of our democracy. I dare say we're going through that period now, some of us. We're a little bit worried about whether our democracy will stand or not. In 1849, Henry Thoreau said that he was imagining a truly free and enlightened state, but he was wondering if such a thing was possible. and he was also wondering the best way to get that. Now, we can write petitions, we can hang up flags, we can wear buttons, we can put signs in our yard, but is that really doing something for human rights, for the marginalized citizens of our society? Thoreau was very aware with the fugitive slave law that sometimes the government does things that we do not agree with. So maybe then it's time for people to take more drastic action. The law will never make men free, he said. It is men who have got to make the law free. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law, the higher law, when the government breaks it. So the people I've been talking about are all from the 19th century. There's a really great quote I'm going to finish with. Van Wyck Brooks wrote The Flowering of New England in 1836. He said about the people I was just talking about, and so many more. They were teachers and educators and bringers of light, with a deep and affectionate feeling of obligation towards the young republic their fathers had brought into being. That New England was appointed to guide the nation, to civilize it and humanize it, none of them ever doubted. He's talking about the people of the 19th century. He's talking about us. We are the people of New England. And maybe it's time that we do a little bit more so that we can make the law free. 150 years from now, what are the historians of Concord going to be saying about us when they do this slide presentation? Thank you very much.
If people have questions.